Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Priya Budani, and I'd like to welcome each one of you to this webinar in partnership with CII on effective governance for related party transactions. Over the course of this webinar, we'd like to discuss regulatory framework around RPT under various statutes, why corporates need a rethink on how they view RPT governance, why a proactive and a comprehensive approach to RPT governance is inevitable now, and how to develop and implement an RPT governance policy that meets transparency, documentation, and disclosure requirements. If you have any questions during the session, please feel free to post the same on our Q&A box, and we will take it up towards the end of the session. I'd now like to invite Fatima Hunaif, a related party governance expert and a qualified chartered accountant. Fatima has over 2 decades of experience in transfer pricing consulting and is named as one of the women leaders in Tax in India 2020. She takes a keen interest in helping companies up their governance in related party transactions to appropriate benchmarks, transparency in disclosing key aspects of the RPTs, and documentation. With that, I hand it over to Fatima.
Thank you, Priya. It's my pleasure to present a brief profile of Mr. MP Vijay Kumar, the co-chairman of Confederation of Indian Industries, the CII, Southern Region Economic Affairs, Taxation and Corporate Governance Subcommittee, and he's also the Chief Financial Officer of Sify Technologies. MPV is a chartered accountant, a cost accountant, and a company secretary. He's very recently voted in as a member of IFRS Advisory Council 2019-21, and also serves as a council member of Institute of Chartered Accountants of India since 2016, and as a member on the SEBI Committee on Disclosures in Accounting. His leadership roles include heading the Accounting Standards Board, Financial Reporting Review Board, and Committee on Accounting Standards for local bodies, as Vice Chairman, and Digital Accounting and Assurance Board and Valuation Standards Board as Chairman. He's recognized amongst the 100 most influential CFOs in India by CIMA, making the roll of honor of the top 100 CFOs in India, and very recently the National Award for Contribution to Financial Accounting by Capital Foundation Society. He also dons other hats as a speaker on professional circuit in India and the Middle East, Southeast Asia on IFRS, accounting standards, audit, corporate laws, and capital market. MPV, I invite you to present the keynote, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Fatima. Thanks for those kind words and introduction. Hearty welcome and greetings to all the members to this webinar. Trust you are safe and all your near and dear ones healthy. Thanks to GT for partnering with CII in putting together this interaction on a very important topic on effective governance for related party transactions. A special thanks to the panel moderator Fatima and members Sri Santana Krishnan, Banu Prakash, Rajiv Kaithan, and Jagannathan for accepting our invite to be here. On related parties transactions, I have a few quick thoughts from my experience. My experience is about 8-9 years in Sundaram Finance, where I've learned all the basics of governance, which I'm proud of. Then about 9 years as a practicing chartered accountant, having seen many mid-sized corporates, and last 14 years at Sify, which is a US SEC listed company. So I'll share my few thoughts based on this experience. Related party transactions require governance and a legal framework, as it is a matter dealing with public confidence. My quick thoughts on RPT. One is that related party transactions are extremely common, and there is nothing wrong in having related party transactions. I've come across many professionals with whom I have exchanged thoughts over a long period of time, where the moment they talk of related party transactions or even as audit fraternity, including article students I've seen, the moment they see art related party transactions, they feel a little uncomfortable. I don't know why somebody feels uncomfortable when there are related party transactions, but that's the experience you come across. But my view, related party transactions, the law allows you to do it. The law allows you to do it without any restrictions, subject to following a particular governance mechanism. And look at any organization as it grows. Even if you take in our personal life, if I would require, let's say, a temporary debt, let's assume I'm constructing a new house, I'm short of some 10, 20 lakhs. The first call I'm likely to make is to my brother. It's so very common. So similarly, businesses as they grow, and you have 5, 6 entities within the group carrying on different activities, it is quite natural that there could be either reasons of capital requirement or there could be business transactions necessitated. Let's take a simple example of somebody like a TCS. So if you take an organization like TCS, when their employees travel at least within India, you can't expect them to stay in ITC hotels. You would naturally expect them to stay only in India hotels, the Taj hotels. So those kind of related party transactions are extremely common. So I don't think anyone should ever start with the fundamental assumption that related party transactions means they are sham, etc. So we need to remove that particular thinking. And forums like this, and every forum I participate, I try my best to remove that kind of initial impression which people tend to frame on related party transactions. Anything which is not transparent, the stakeholders do not get confidence. And hence, whether it is accounting standards or SEBI LODR requirements, all of them, they do not prohibit, but they only encourage disclosures. They encourage disclosures because if you are keeping it like this, there is always a desire to know what's there inside. So the moment you show it like this, people are very comfortable. And if you look at the disclosure requirements, be it Companies Act or LODR or the accounting standards, all of them give you an opportunity to also explain the nature of those transactions. Lastly, leaving aside transfer pricing requirements, which is basically for revenue purposes and assessing taxable value. When it comes to the price at which related party transactions should happen, I do keep coming across people who have this notion that related party transactions should happen only at market price or at fair value. I'm not a fan of that particular statement. I'll give a very simple example. Let's assume I have a subsidiary where 70% of its production is underwritten by the parent company. I buy 70% of the output. The remaining 30%, they go and find 7, 8 customers, incur marketing costs, sales costs, credit risk, and arrive at a price. So the price at which the subsidiary would supply to me has to obviously be lesser than the unit price they would realize outside. It is for me to go and justify to whoever saying that this is the rationale of how this price has been fixed at. But I should not look at ways and means of how do I do a reverse compensation, etc. We should stand boldly and say that, yes, for the underwriting I'm doing, for the zero marketing costs, for the zero selling costs, for the zero credit risk which you have, this is the price which obviously is lower than what somebody would treat as a fair value in the open market. I'm sure Fatima, given her vast experience and practicing on a specific domain like governance in related party transactions, will enable an engaged panel discussion, which should give us good insights on various facets of related party transactions and governance associated. Panel members are all very experienced leaders in governance. Rajiv alone, I had the opportunity of getting introduced now, but the last 7, 8 minutes of my interaction with him, it was so pleasant and such a knowledgeable person. Other members I've interacted over time. I'm sure all of them will give good insights based on their long decades of experience. So wish you all a very happy learning session. Stay safe, stay accountable.
Fantastic, MPV. Thank you so much. That's a great start, and look forward to our panel deliberation and for your presence there as well. Thank you. Great. So wouldn't it be interesting to know what is the related party transaction level? MPV referred to it multiple times in his keynote. Wouldn't it be great to know what are the levels of related party transactions in global businesses and Indian businesses? So I'd give you a couple of seconds to take a guess at it. Take a shot at it. Great. So this is some data that we researched, our teams researched and put together. Data available on the US IRS website through country by country reports, CBCR reports, submitted by 1,600 largest US headquartered multinationals. And the percentage, average percentage of related party transactions over their turnover, global consolidated turnover, stands at 29%. This is only the top 1,600 largest global corporations. The histograms present the volume of transactions, and the maximum volume we see is in low tax, low regulated countries, the tallest bar, followed by the two largest market services and manufacturing jurisdictions, India and China, followed by the other countries. So overall, it's about 29%. This by no means is reflective of the global percentage. In fact, some of the research reports that I've read published by OECD even ranks the intra-group trade, global trade, intra-group of the total business transacted at over 80%. So let's have a look at what the scenario is in India. The average RPT over transaction value of the bunch of 100 top companies in India by market capitalization stands at 18%. Revenue expressed as a percentage, RPT expressed as a percentage of the total revenue of these companies. Again, we've put it down by sector to give you an idea. The tallest bar is telecom, representing one of the largest telecom companies. Primarily, the transactions are investment, business restructuring, financing, right to use assets. The second bar, tallest bar, is of a couple of companies represented in the diversified sector. Predominant nature of transactions is again purchase and sale of goods and financial transactions. The pharma bar represents 11 largest companies by market cap in India. And again, the nature of transactions intra-group are purchase and sale of goods and financial transactions. So typically that's the lay of the land. Now, as MPV mentioned, and before I get into regulations, RPT related party transactions need not necessarily reflect a red flag. They have become necessary, especially after, because it was very hard for companies that are unaffiliated to get funding. Very hard to have secure and predictable supply chains if you're not operating or control on the various critical parts of the supply chain. And again, to obviate any kind of uncertainty. Now, I love the examples which MPV gave in terms of our personal context, right? So when we need something, it's easiest to approach a related party. And what happens there? Why is it that the transaction gets facilitated so fast in related party situation? The reason is that several guards that we have up while dealing with independent parties, we don't have while dealing with related parties. Several of those considerations fall on our blind side. And as a result of which, in the case of public listed companies, several other stakeholders get impacted because of related party transactions. And there are those which, again, as MPV mentioned, if it is like this, people don't know, and then there are chances of misappropriations and other issues that arise due to related party transactions and lack of governance. So therefore, for a variety of reasons, we have very strong regulations in place, the Companies Act 2013 and the SEBI listing obligations and disclosure requirement regulations. Both of these together govern and define related parties, the coverage of transactions amongst related parties, and also put down the approval process, that what are the categories of transactions which you can engage in, which companies can engage in, what are the categories that need different levels of approvals, and finally, what are those categories of transactions which need the highest level of approvals before shareholders. And then finally, if these things are not met, they also prescribe penal consequences on account of misgovernance in related party transactions. So at the heart of all this is safeguarding stakeholder interest. Apart from these, the other well-known regulations that govern related party transactions and pricing in that are your income tax, the direct and indirect tax laws. Again, because this has a direct consequence and impact on the income tax that companies end up paying. Coming to the approval process. As I mentioned, there are a couple of different channels of approvals, one prescribed by the Companies Act and the other prescribed under the SEBI LODR norms. As far as the Companies Act is concerned, it's pretty much an enabler. As long as the transactions are in the ordinary course of business and are at an arm's length, then just an audit committee, where an audit committee is required, approval is sufficient. Again, if the transactions are not in the ordinary course of business and are not at arm's length, the audit committee plus a board of director approval is required. When a company's proposed related party transactions are not in the ordinary course, which means these are not transactions which are by definition in their business, something which they would engage in, and are not at arm's length, plus exceed specified limits. Now, few limits are prescribed, the most common one being 10% of the value of the turnover. So if the value of the proposed related party transaction exceeds the level, and I'll refer to it as the materiality level, and both those limits are not met, then it needs approvals across the spectrum, audit committee, board, and shareholders. In the Companies Act, there's a carve out for transactions which holding companies engage with subsidiaries, wholly owned subsidiaries, because that was found redundant. Now there is control and there is complete control, and therefore the approval process became more of academic relevance, and therefore the carve out was incorporated. As far as the SEBI is concerned, all RPTs require audit committee and board of directors approvals. Highest level of approval before shareholders is required when the value of transactions are material. So the catchphrases here are ordinary course, not ordinary course, material, and arm's length. And we'll explore these topics more through practical lens of different role holders in our panel discussion, as well as in subsequent slides. Now, I talked about arm's length. Arm's length determination is not a straitjacketed exercise. It all depends on the nature of the transactions, and the benchmarking process can be very different. And I'd like to submit, based on my experience here as a transfer pricing professional for 20 years, is that 90% of that experience of mine was not relevant when we came and when we spoke about arm's length determination in intra-group, primarily for governance purposes. And why is that I say that? Transfer pricing in a traditional context tended to be one-sided. It tended to end up applying one of the rigid methods prescribed in the income tax law. And stopped with determining whether one party has earned enough margin or not. In fact, even when it earns more than the required threshold, we tend to conclude that the party is at arm's length. But when we put that same analogy in a corporate governance context, it leads to redundancies. It leads to impractical results, because here we need to justify the whole transaction end to end from a giver and a receiver, because both companies are part of the same group. So what are those factors we take into account in doing this bespoke arm's length analysis? One, look at the specific characteristics of the transaction and the contractual terms. So we don't just do, hey, this is the transaction, benchmark it. We take a step back, understand the full transaction, the context of the transaction, who are the parties, what is their role, what are the business drivers, how does this transaction fit into the operations of the company, and then what are the economic realities. For example, in COVID, the pricing could be very different as compared to in a normal year. And then does the company have comparable transactions available internally before trying to benchmark using public data points? In our experience, majority of comparable information one can get and glean from the company itself by passing it through the points 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 mentioned on the slide. You only go for external comparables when you've exhausted all of this and there are no further data points available, and then we look outside. So what comes in handy is a very high level of awareness of the business and economic realities and the transparency between the management and the people who are trying to benchmark the transaction. Several transactions we've come across, and one needs to engage in these, and they are mentioned on the slide. For example, sale of business, restructuring, investment, financial transactions, and every little transaction that a company engages in is a transaction, whether it is documented, whether it is in writing, or whether or not there is an agreement in place. Now, this slide represents a typical audit review procedure designed around related party transactions. And I know for a fact that these audit procedures are very stringent and very detailed, with a lot of sub-processes underlying each of these steps. Starting from identification of related parties, identification of related party transactions, reviewing what have been the approvals, reviewing the records, again, reviewing the arm's length price benchmarking, what are the disclosures and documentations. I know that directors are asked for declarations to express their interests in any other companies or linked organizations, so that there is a full disclosure and knowledge at the level of audit and with the management on what could be the potential related parties and therefore related party transactions. Some of the aspects require far more detailed scrutiny. And then there are further detailed audit procedures which one performs as an auditor. For example, unusual related party transactions, not in the ordinary course of business, very high volume. Again, if the company or the corporate setup is very complex, where one cannot see a transaction end to end, that is where one would design a few more detailed procedures to help unearth or to see the end of the transaction. And if there are other risk indicators which might direct the auditor to the fact that, look here, there needs to be a greater scrutiny. So some of the examples one finds through audit review procedures that in spite of best efforts, there could be non-identification of related parties. Now that's the very start where there is no identification itself. That's the biggest gap of related parties. Then there are inadvertent breaches of omnibus approvals. Now, omnibus approvals in the ordinary course of business subject to a particular limit that the audit committee would decide that for this company, this size, historically, this is the value one can easily approve. But due to whatever reasons, one doesn't know, one keeps passing through the transactions and finally it's discovered there's been a breach. At times, no arm's length evaluations done of the related party transactions, and lack of parity. Again, if a company is engaging in transactions, again, MPV did refer to this, that there are a bunch of companies externally, one is engaging in transactions, similar transactions with related parties. Somehow the parity is not maintained, or there is no qualitative differentiation between the two categories of transactions. And most of all, inadequate documentation around the related party transactions. So what are the very publicly reported examples of misgovernance in related party transactions? Now we know that, and we've established the fact that related party transaction is the need of the hour. In fact, in our experience, the whole of last year, in a majority of the IT companies, the companies that did the least amount of retrenchments were group companies. And they actually supported the employees and held on to the employment. This is just one example of how being in a group and transacting in a group has a lot of benefits and advantages and different aspects, right? But having said that, the corollary is also true, where related parties and the presence of related parties creates that opportunity for people to misuse. And there have been widely reported cases of such misgovernance in very large corporates. The first one being the biggest domestic airline company in India, where the two co-promoters sparred with each other. One accused the other of misgovernance in related party transactions, with the result that SEBI was asked to step in. It stepped in, ultimately levying a penalty of more than 2 crore and other consequences. In this case, there was also a report by a consulting firm which was not presented to the audit committee on related party transactions. Now, not going too deep into this, these are well-known examples. The second one being a large alcohol beverage company, where again the SEBI stepped in, and this was misdirection of funds, diversion of funds with consequences. The third example is of a home buyers association challenging the transaction of the promoters to divert almost 10,000 crores to other group companies, thereby putting them at a disadvantage and the stalling of their own projects where they had bought homes, with again consequences on the company and the promoters and several other key managerial personnel. Now, I think it's evidently clear that this whole, the magnitude of the transactions just indicates that it can't be just one person who's able to put through these type of transactions. And then lastly, the example of the power sector example, where there were investigations, removal of the chairman, again, diversion of funds to for the benefit of group companies. So that brings us to, how do we uphold corporate governance in related party transactions? Yes, we need principles. The principles being of fairness, transparency, accountability, and responsibility. And we need upholders of these principles. Companies management, board of directors, audit committee, auditors, shareholders, and consultants, working together to ensure that the principles of corporate governance in related party transactions is upheld. Now, I look forward to deliberating on these aspects in our panel. I have a very esteemed panel of speakers today, representing each of the dimensions of the upholders of good corporate governance in their individual professional roles. And in the aggregate, we have an experience of almost more than 160 years on this panel today. I look forward to facilitating this panel. MPV, we already know you. Thank you for the keynote. I'd like to introduce next Mr. Santana Krishnan. He is the managing partner, PKF Sridhar Santanam LLP, and also long-time independent director on several Tata Group companies. He comes with 4 decades of specialized experience in accounting and finance, strategy and planning, and acquisitions with international exposure. He's a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India and managing partner of PKF, as I already mentioned. He was involved in the Central Council of ICAI for 15 years till 2015 and has served on various committees of the Institute, including the Accounting Standards Board. He's also on the boards of various companies. He's actively involved with multiple government and industry bodies and a member of high-level committee on CSR formed by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Mr. Jagannathan Chakravarti, CFO of Sonata Software. He's a business partner and a strategist who focuses on shareholder value creation, an automation champion, a champion of governance, enabling a strong profitable growth with a strong cash flow. He has a clear understanding and deep knowledge in all areas of business and technology, and including taxation, international taxation, revenue, and other finance operations, with experience in SAP and Oracle Financials. Rajiv Khaitan, Senior Partner, Khaitan & Company LLP, also Independent Director on various boards of listed companies. He has over 30 years of experience in business laws, regulations, corporate governance, financing, structuring, M&A, licensing, what have you, a whole host of professional experience across different sectors, including retail, franchising, and real estate sector. He serves as an independent director on many listed and unlisted companies and a trustee of the Akshara Foundation, which is dedicated to ensuring quality preschool and primary education for every child. Bhanu, partner, corporate governance, risk and operations, Grant Thornton Bharat. He's a CA with 20 years of experience in risk consulting, specializing in areas of corporate governance, risk-based internal audits, enterprise risk management, and business process reviews. He is the national leader for healthcare and pharma sector. He is a member of Global Governance Leaders Group of Grant Thornton and has authored several articles on corporate governance. He has advised some of the industry leaders in healthcare, pharma, IT, ITES sectors to implement robust governance processes, control environment, etc. I welcome you all. And with that, a rapid question to all our panelists. What does good governance in related party transactions mean to you? And how do you see your role in ensuring this? Let's start with MPV.
No, I've shared it as part of my keynote address, Fatima. So as far as good governance is concerned, I would say that it essentially is tone at the top and how the organization DNA is set. And when I say tone at the top, it shouldn't be confused with the messages which are communicated through town hall meetings of the company or through the internal communications. The tone at the top essentially is the conduct of the top management in terms of how they are dealing with these situations, because the people are all observing. The people are all observing. The next level leadership, the leadership below, all of them are observing. So it is that conduct which is the most important one. While we have the regulations and all that stuff which are there, I would see them as to a large extent a check in the box. But I think if somebody is able to comply with what they believe is appropriate and passes their conscience, that would actually be much higher level of compliance than what is prescribed in law. I'm saying this from my experience, particularly at Sundaram Finance. That organization still fascinates me. And at the age of 22, having started my career there, I was fortunate to be a secretary of one of their material subsidiaries. The way I've seen the entire top leadership and board of directors approach various governance matters, they have so much ingrained in me that even today, nobody can take that away out of me. I would behave exactly the way they have trained me at the start. I would say that as the tone of the top, which is the most important.
Casting a very positive shadow from the top and outlining the governance around that. Thank you, MPV. Jagan, if I could come to you next for your response on this.
Yeah. Hi all. I actually echo the same thing what MPV has told now. The tone and top is very, very important because for me, from industry practice perspective, I believe the spirit is more important than the regulation. So few of these things, the tone and the top, particularly communicating, if you are in doubt, please disclose, please ask questions. If there is a transaction, you have a doubt, please disclose it to the board and ask a clarification from them or ask a clarification from the technical expert. So it is better to get it clarified. And if there is a bad news or something is not wrong, the bad news should take elevators and good news take steps. So this is the basic concepts like this has to be followed when the governance is coming. The spirit is very important. Then the regulation, particularly regulation, and in case even if your regulation allows some more length is there, please cut it at least 100 meters before that. You have to be extra cautious in being disclosing, not because the regulation wants or the penalty comes in. It is because that's how the governance has worked. A company, when I'm sitting in as a CFO, what I will ensure is I will ensure that the compliance is at least a little ahead of what is required. Disclosure will be little more. Even if there is a doubt, we will disclose it. First of all, disclose it. Then we will discuss, take the input from the directors. I completely believe it's a culture in the company and culture what we all adapt to. In my earlier organization, which is known for its governance, we have done it many a time. Integrity has been a very, very stable focus. The same case with my current organization also. We are very, very much focused on integrity and the extra disclosures or careful in being adherent to any regulations anywhere in the globe, because we don't know that last 100 meters can be interpreted differently. We wanted to be always be cautious on what are the disclosure that comes in.
Fantastic. So culture and integrity is actually integral and defines the level of governance. Thank you, Jagan.
Correct. Yeah.
Sandhana Krishnan, may I come to you next?
I think I agree with both my earlier speakers. I must first thank all of you for giving me this opportunity, and good afternoon to everybody. Second is probably the most difficult job of an independent director or a board is to only look at the related party transactions. If you have looked at the negative side of it, most of the corporate failures have taken place primarily because nobody looked at the related party transactions. So integrity of the management is what is probably the most important, because very difficult for the directors in a matter of half an hour, 1 hour to go into the entire transaction and come to a conclusion this transaction is good or not good. Therefore, integrity, of course, plays the most important role. And knowledge of this transaction is very, very essential. I think the independent directors or the board would have discharged 50% of its responsibility if it is able to scrutinize related party transactions well. And probably of late, it has been becoming more of a routine rather than a very specialized one. I think it requires special attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandhana Krishnan. So focus the limited time available at the board as an independent director on understanding and approving related party transactions. Thank you so much. Rajiv, may I come to you next?
Good evening to everybody, and thank you for joining us on this webinar. I agree with all my earlier speakers that the RPT is one of the most difficult things to handle as an independent director, but in a certain way, it is also the most easiest, because when you see a transaction, you can always make out there is something called a smell test, which any transaction that is slightly out of usual, unusual, asking a few questions gives out the transaction very, very clearly. So in the limited time that an independent director has a board, to see the agenda papers and to understand the transaction, ask a few questions, it is difficult. But that is why most of these boards of larger companies now adopt the process-oriented detection of this process. So if as part of the audit committee or as part of your risk evaluation committee, you have set the right processes, and have the right internal audit carried out of some of these functions, it becomes easier because with the growing number of KMPs in a company, to just keep track of all the companies that are related parties under law, it's very difficult. But when it comes to a transaction that is before the board, if you ask the right questions, like a logical, simple way, analyze the questions, you will understand that something unusual is there in a particular transaction, or is it normal? Have the company followed the processes? Most of the large companies now have processes for conduct of normal business. And if any part of that process looks like have been omitted, that's the first smell test that we guess that there is something wrong. Let's dig deeper. So all the points that everybody made, transparency, integrity, culture, all that goes from the top to the bottom. But the information flow which comes from the bottom brings up all the telltale signs. If the documents have been done properly, if the proper note is there, who is making it. So I would say that it's tough, but easy if you take care in the beginning and have a structure that will help you. As independent directors, you can always ask for a transaction to be reviewed by an auditor or a consultant, and therefore you can do it. But the other thing that you have to be in mind is you don't know that business as well as the management do. So the trust in the management and the fact that they are dealing with some of these things with full disclosure is very important.
Thank you, Rajiv. Very insightful and encouraging as to how one could practically go about and try and balance the needs of the hour in the limited time, but also using the other resources. Thank you for that. Bhanu, a quick response from your side on the as an auditor.
Thanks, Fatima. Good afternoon, everybody. Privileged to share the virtual dais with such senior professionals. I think from my perspective as auditor, or as internal auditor, or as governance expert, I echo with everybody what they said. Probably I'll just cover it in two words. For me, good governance means proactive compliance and going beyond compliance. That means how do we implement the rule? How do we implement the governance practice in the spirit than just in the pure as a rule book? And from that perspective, as auditors, as internal auditors, as governance advisors, I think we have primary three roles. One, helping the company to give that independent view on compliance, helping companies to, sharing the tools and techniques to ensure proactive compliance and how we can help in the process. Third, and most important aspect is also in sharing those emerging practices which help companies to go beyond compliance and set the path for better transparency and governance. That's my view. Thank you.
And thank you, Bhanu, for the go beyond and go beyond the minimum and actually aim for much higher level of disclosures and compliances. And I'll answer the question from my perspective as a consultant, and that's basically around really understanding the transaction, being transparent so that the right arm's length determination can happen, and a deeper level of documentation, move beyond the 1 or 2 pages certification. So I advocate documenting the roles and responsibilities of the transacting parties and creating a deeper level of documentation, which helps everybody thereafter in making the decisions and in also serving as an evidence of the transaction undertaken. Jagan, I'd like to come to you with my next question. There seems to be missing out on identification of related parties based on whatever we've come across. So could you throw some light on what the challenges could be on the ground whereby, the identification of related parties has become a difficult issue? And what are the best practices that you would want to share with the audience?
Yeah, traditionally the challenge was actually the commercial transaction. That's not the question of same group company, we do a related party transaction, giving loan, taking money, or any other transaction, because these things are all very clear. The regulation has matured now over a period of time. All of us know what is the filter, how to filter it, how to report it, and all those stuff. The question comes in when the commercial transaction happens between two organizations. Okay. For example, in one of my earlier company, the key investor was also the promoter of another coffee company who was supplying coffee to us. So I didn't know whether the coffee transaction, which is like an arm's length transaction, should we do that, or because we have a past relationship, they gave a different rate for us compared to what is given in the market. So will you say it is not an arm's length? That's a basic question that comes in, right? So we have taken the same investor or same investor have a common investor having more than 20% as a facility also. We have taken that in lease. Because we were large enough and we were one of the pioneers, we have taken it in a different kind of rate with compared to others. It is almost like 40%, 50% less than others. Will you consider that as a related party transaction or arm's length or not? That's a question comes in, which has to go. It is a related party transaction, that's for sure. But know how to present it to the board is my challenge. That comes in the commercial transaction whenever it happens. That regularly happens between the company. For example, my current organization, we have a subsidiary company which actually supplies the licenses to us also. As a software company, we also take the license from our subsidiary company. Whether that will, how much of license, what is the rate you give it at the cost, then it becomes like what is the kind of reporting you have to do for it. Exchange of resources between two organizations, even if it is like I need between the organization for utilization, better utilization of resources, sometimes exchange of resources happen, and common pool of resources like finance, HR, all those people. These becomes an issue on what will be the exact arm's length price at which you will do that. So these are the normal challenges, but it has come down a little bit after the domestic transfer pricing regulations have come in. So we know that this is there is a definition available for us to rely on and then use that as a base for doing this. It has improved now. The other one happens to be like an investor, common investor between two different organizations. The investor can be common, they may have more investment, they are just an investor. Okay, if they are in the board of both the organizations. So how do you do? Like for example, in my parent or group, there is an insurance company who gives a commercial quote to me for an insurance. So how will I deal with that? So these are the kind of challenges that will happen only in those cases. But I don't think it has become so difficult that you are not able to discriminate. Now the regulations are more stable and much more clear. We are able to differentiate between what is this and what is that. But there can be questions comes in these kind of transactions. I just gave few examples of it. Little more intricate on what is the best price you get, cost price, that cost price you get, then what happens to that? It may be because I have negotiated hard. That credit, I can't take the credit because this becomes a related party transaction.
Thank you, Jagan, for your practical insights. Bhanu, I'd like to come to you next. Now, auditors, and still on the identification of related party topic, because we know that there are instances where, because of, the definitions being so wide and the level of relationships that, various directors and others could have in other companies may not be very clearly known. So auditors perform variety of checks, ask for disclosures. In spite of that, there are instances where one is not able to intentionally or unintentionally. So what are the best practices you would recommend on the part of the management to further help close these kind of gaps of identification?
Sure. Thanks, Fatima. I think Jagan spent a good amount of time on saying, if you identify a transaction, then what are the interpretation issues which may then lead it itself into a question whether it's a related party transaction. I'll probably take a step back. What we have seen as examples or what we have seen as situations is there has been miss on identifying the related party itself. So what it means is clearly three aspects. Either there's a lack of awareness amongst employees to know which are the related parties. Second, in terms of do I have a robust mechanism to identify all the parties and the transaction? Third, and how much I have leveraged technology to identify potential RPTs. So, as simple as, if you have complex structure, you have multiple SPVs, multiple stakeholders, it's important to then enable or ensure that the people who are dealing with them are adequately trained and told them that, look, these are the type of transactions which can be classified as RPT. And we as a company, as a higher governance mechanism, we have an obligation to disclose So ensure, please let us know if you have such a transaction. So one is awareness of the people and reinforcing it periodically. Second is, do I have a robust mechanism to identify? One, I obviously rely on people, but I can always not just only rely on people. I have to also have a robust process. So do I have checks and balances? Like whenever I'm entering into a transaction with any vendor or customer, do I have a placeholder to check? Hey, is this a related party? Let us know yes or no. And we can go more in detail. The third element is how I can leverage technology, how I can leverage my current ERP to map all the RPTs and I track all those transactions so that I have a better track on what are the RPTs which I want and how I disclose them with the full value. So these are the three dimensions I thought it's most important from my experience.
Thank you, Banu. SK, if I could come to you next.
Sure.
So how do you, in your role as an independent director, how do you approach related party transaction approvals? You did mention that majority of the time you would like to spend on understanding, reviewing related party transactions on boards. So what aspect do you ask for from the management to satisfy yourself on the arm's length nature of the transaction and whether the transaction is actually necessary?
One is, of course, as I mentioned, the integrity of the management is important. Fortunately, I've been in Tata boards, so where the integrity is not the issue at all, and therefore it has been a lot more easier for me. Not that I have not faced difficulties elsewhere. But I really want to ask other colleagues also, is it correct for us to exclude the management from the related party? You are saying that somebody will initiate, and the person who initiates will not participate, will not take responsibility. It will make the independent directors responsible for an action of somebody. I always say there is an asymmetry of information between the management and the independent director. They know everything, independent directors don't know anything, and they will have to take a decision. Fundamentally, I think it is wrong for us to exclude the management directors from a related party. They should first own it. Ask them to certify that it is in their interest. It is the interest of the company, not in their interest, in the interest of the company. I think that's where I think probably the legislation will also have to change. Need to bring them back into accountability is very essential. Second is, should we put a restriction, because can there be a 100% related party transaction? You take a car manufacturer, maybe your chromium plating for a Maruti can't be same as for anybody else. So should there be transactions which are 100% will have to be related party? Or should there be an outside parties also involved in it? For example, 80-20, 70-30. Because today I find management outsources their responsibility to consultants. Consultants always give an opinion fair. And I have not come across cases where consultants have refused the related party transaction. That's a danger for the independent directors. I also believe that we must ask them to publish how many related party transactions were rejected by the audit committee or by the board or by the consultants. Probably you'll get less than 1%. That itself is a danger for us. Therefore, in my opinion, maybe other than what is very typically needed, for example, Tata brand, it's 100% goes to a related party. But rest of it, should there be a restriction? Somebody cannot do more than 80% with a related party, 50% with a related party, is something very, very essential. After you decide on the integrity of the management, then you decide that there is an outside quotation available, then only you come to justification when the quotation is not available. The outside benchmarking itself is not there, then those are the transactions which I would like to concentrate, and it is very, very essential. Second is, I always like to take a big picture. Should we then eliminate all less than 20%, this ERP, mapping, all that? They're all going to be with reference to smaller transactions. Should we say larger transactions will have to be identified? I think that we may not be able to miss even if it is an audit committee or the board, because educating everybody is going to take a lot of time. Therefore, I always look at integrity, then the need for doing it with a related party, which is very, very essential. Are there external suppliers and are you benchmarking the price to it? People will say so many things, but then that will have to be looked at. But I think ultimately, if information, concise information is available, how many transactions were rejected by the management, by the audit committee, by the board, by the consultants? That is where we always, in the Tata board, we always ask, Did you make any change after the consultants came? How did you justify it? When it is 99%, 100%, then it worries me. Then we'll have to probably look different. I think instead of outsourcing your thinking to outside consulting firms, I know you and I will lose business. I'm sorry about it. But certainly we need to see that the management takes some responsibility on this. We seem to be very keen on putting the responsibility on the independent directors, board, SEBI, everybody. But I think management also should take responsibility. I mean, a tough job, but I don't think it is difficult to implement. Thank you.
Thank you, SK. Several suggestions. I'll take those questions as suggestions for policymakers and other influencers on this panel and outside. Rajiv, if I could direct some of that to you in the form of a question as to, do you often seek external validation when related party transactions are presented before you for approval?
Yeah, so we will need to take external valuation if we smell that there is something wrong, the full information is not flowing out, proper processes that company follows in similar transactions for other transactions has been done or not, whether there is some unique feature in that related party which is very, very relevant for the business, and you are aware based on the background that this is not really available, or even if it is available, it is not from a trustworthy source, especially when you talk about intangibles. When you talk about quality of service, timing of service, ability to provide that service during times when there is a shortage. So some of those linkages that are there in some related party transactions actually is valuable, so long as you follow the rules and guidelines that the law permits. For example, whether as a whole the total transaction is arm's length. Arm's length is not just arm's length pricing, as one of my speakers pointed out. It's the overall bundle of all the available elements in that transaction that is looked at as a whole. So at times we do take external validation on valuation, if that is a question, on benchmarking in similar transactions when they are going to be regular in regular transactions over a period of time. Some of the times that you really need is whether the related party disclosures are correct or not, that comes out of audit, because it's at times you don't know what your relatives are doing, which companies they are on, where they have invested. How can I know in this almost unitary world now that what my relatives were, named relatives or associate companies are doing? Because of confidentiality reasons, at times you don't exchange some of these information. So it is when a transaction is being taken with the company, and at that time, all the diligence that is done with that counterparty and its business, that's the time we try to get some detail as to whether the transaction looks like an ordinary course of business. I'm aware that some of the times these questions arise in a transaction which is not ordinary course, but when I say ordinary course for that transaction. So if it is usual for that transaction to have such elements in pricing or other terms and conditions, then you also want to ensure that the business continues. You don't want to be a restriction or a hurdle for the management also. And therefore, you take a call based on all these elements that you apply in your normal logic that you use in your daily life. It comes out. Anything that you feel is wrong, if your answers are not proper, are not as expected, then you do an external evaluation, or just say, please give us more information, or just put your negative vote. That's all.
Sure. So encourage a healthy discussion and a debate on the transaction based on what you're feeling from what you're hearing. Thank you, Rajiv. MPV, there's a question from one of our audiences, and I think it's completely linked to your opening keynote, where you said that you do believe RPTs are grounded in the need and are above board. So the point being made by one of our audiences is that RPTs are typically carried on only for compliance to regulations, but in letter and not in spirit. And therefore, we are seeing such large scale frauds in the corporate world. And then on the back of it, more regulation. So what would you have to say for that?
I think it's from Mr. Anil Sharma. I'm not sure whether he's the same Mr. Anil Sharma whom I know. Who's a very senior member from Delhi, very acknowledged professional. So if it is the same gentleman, I know. See, as far as this question is concerned, let me answer in two parts. One is, I know there have been corporate frauds, not just in India, across the globe. There are several, and reasons for failure are many. As Mr. SK mentioned, there have been management failures at board levels, maybe at times, maybe audit misses as well. But I think we also need to acknowledge that there are a large number of companies, maybe 60, 70, 80, I don't have a statistic to prove, who are actually following good governance practices. I know there are 3%, 5%, whatever number of entities where there are failures. But I think we also need to, at the same time, celebrate the fact that the reasonably very large number of companies who have been following good governance practices as defined in law, and some of them beyond what is there in law as well. And if you recall what I told about my first organization, some of those which are now in law did not exist at the time, but they actually practice the same. So I think we also need to celebrate that fact. When it comes to frauds, particularly the diversion of funds and all, I think frauds are something which are done by people who have malafide intention. They do it by design, it's conceived, etc. So I think there are exceptions. Ideally, they should be as low as possible, but there are those exceptions. I think those exceptions probably we need to address it by a combination of measures, which as Mr. SK and Jagannathan was pointing out, ensuring integrity at management level, and probably at the board level, we need to have directors who can actually spend time and who understand the business. And I noticed most cases, directors, their ability to give time or the organization's intent to use directors' time, both is low. I think it's important we need to increase that part as well. And beyond that, there are other stakeholders like, let's say the banking system, who gives the huge amount of credits and has opportunity to trace the end user funds, but they've chosen to maybe turn a blind eye, which has left to the diversion of funds or siphoning of funds as defined in the RBI guidelines. So when it comes to diversion as defined in RBI guidelines, it is about using it for purpose other than for which it is meant. Siphoning is about inability to trace where it has gone. So I think these definitions are pretty clear. And Mr. Anil Sharma is also aware that we have now the CARO 2020, which has listed down a few governance requirements to be addressed inside CARO. Hopefully, it will reduce instances of such large-scale misuse. I don't want to say it will become zero, because it is also a function of the overall society ethos and all. And if I can take another 30 seconds, Fatima, there is this overall society ethos which is connected to this effectiveness of governance. For example, it's very personal view, happy to debate later, but I strongly hold this view. We've all moved from a concept of joint families, large families, to very nuclearized families where you have this I, me, myself concept. And I've come across many individual professionals who consider themselves that they're not even answerable to family members. So when you have a society or a set of people who don't consider themselves as answerable to their own parents and family members, how can you expect integrity and accountability with those people being CXOs and having $1 million packages? It's just not possible, you know. So accountability starts, like everything starts at home, it starts at home. So accountability too. So that's my little long response, but that's my views on that.
Thank you. Thank you for the authentic and genuine response, MPV. I think we need to keep on going back and look inwards. And that's what is in our control. So thanks for that. Jagan, I'll come to you next. In terms of, the impact of COVID pandemic and it just kind of moved from regular working to virtual working. What one might have achieved virtual in, say, over the next 10 years or something, we achieved in a matter of months. So what impact of this have you seen in ensuring the highest level of governance, even in virtual working? What has been your experience?
Yeah, actually, Fatima, to say this virtual world, there is a question of security issues come along with that. Okay, whether we want to recognize that or not recognize that, that's a fact that has happened now. Particularly in the banking transaction. In fact, we have, I have come across at least 2-3 banking fraud cases when the international transaction happens during the COVID time. Because it is not that it was not before, but it increased multiple during the COVID time. The challenge for us is for the remote working. I am a little old school in that. I believe that if there is an opportunity for a person to do a mistake, he may do the mistake. Although we have a filter, we have a culture binding him, all this thing. But the systems and controls have to be in such a way that we don't give it that scope to people. Now, what happens is remote working desktop or a laptop independently to him, although the network monitoring happens and all these things, documents, papers, and all these things has an issue. So I believe that remote working, particularly we as a CFO of an organization, I go that extra length into that. I have created at least 10 dashboards from my team to be given to me. I take like a dump of payments that has happened during the week. What are the invoices? When has been sent? What is the process happened? What are the payments happened? Where is the BRS reconciliation? Go back to the old audit kind of situation. It may be a little finicky. My reactions maybe it may be a little overdoing, but I think you need to be very, very careful because we don't know if it is a small amount and it will not catch the eyes of the people. It can go through easily because there are authorizations, there are people who will sign it. I don't think everybody checks, even the finance people see every paper before they sign it or something like that, because somebody else brings the paper to your home for signature and with a mark. And you don't want to go near, you are careful in what is you are getting the document to sign. You finish off the signature, and all of us are so much occupied on meetings after meetings. I don't think there is a checking mechanism. I think that extra supervision model is required at present. Now, somebody has to sit in I put a person who is a retired person who will do it for me and then give a separate report to me on a weekly basis because only someone else who's not in the operation has to see this. This is what probably Bhanu will agree to that. This is what the internal auditors are also doing it. I'm doing it in a little more different way internally itself to keep a monitor on what is the transaction that is happening at this juncture. But I think if we find a kind of platforms which will perform this and then deliver the results for us, I think this will over a period of time, the remote working or virtual working will continue to be effective. And I believe in the long run, 99% of the Indian finance team need not go to office. I don't think it is required. We can continue to do it, but we need a little bit more automated or monitoring system to do that.
Great. And that's a perfect segue what I would like to pose to Bhanu you in terms of, could you outline the opportunities around digitizing the entire life cycle of related party transactions, from identifying to, the benchmarking to documentation to approvals?
Sure. Thanks, Fatima. I think that's a great question. And probably Rajiv has given me enough lead to start on that. He talked about one important point that, how do we trace the relatives of the directors who are doing transactions? And it's not that we are actively tracking it. And that's where I think the technology comes in play is, can I have a database of all the parties? Can I have the keywords, like whether it's PAN card or, whatever number, how can I build that into my database and then sort of link up whenever I do any transaction, it pops up, say, look, there is a related party. This is just one example. So the idea is to see how we can automate controls, how we can bring in controls, link multiple databases so that we have an upfront identification of the related party. The second aspect is to look at is how we can automate the entire process of evaluating a transaction, right? Which you talked about documentation. Can I bring in a robust process, a workflow tool or a dashboard to know what transactions are happening? How do we track them? How do we build adequate supporting documents? And most important is when we want to justify the arm's length, can I bring in or tag the group similar transactions? Can I tag similar transactions so that I have ready data to know what are the similar transactions which have happened at what price, which sort of helps us to then make it better. So there is definitely opportunity to automate the aspects of identifying parties, of bringing a robust mechanism of tracking the journey of related party transaction in terms of documentation and approval. And most important, at times we have seen companies breach the omnibus approval without realizing that the transaction value has already crossed the approval. So how can I put a mechanism to track that, if the actual transaction is hitting the limit, it pops up for me to say, look, this transaction is breaching the limit. There's a need for a prior approval. I think these are the few places I can go on this, but the idea is to see how we can use more technology to make it more proactive compliance, minimize human intervention and thinking on this.
That's a pretty decent indicator of where and how one could go about evaluating digitization in the related party transaction lifecycle as well. Given that, Jagan also foresees 100% virtual work for financial professionals. Indeed, if a lot of them continue to be working the way we are working today. Thanks, Banu. Rajiv, if I could come to you next, as an independent director, you've seen various categories of related party transactions over the course of last several years on several boards. In this situation, what are the types of transactions based on your smell test or detailed tests where you've seen management struggle to justify?
The most difficult part which managements are unable to really explain are areas where it is an intangible service provided by a service provider who does not have many competing service providers. As units who are providing similar service and who have the time and resources to provide to you. So in that, especially in an area where some new development is taking place, the real value of the product or the end product or the service is very, very difficult. And therefore, companies follow normal thumb rules of time and resources plus a margin and some such things. But over time, when that product really becomes successful and more valuable, in hindsight, people question that and allege that you knew that. And therefore, you have given this benefit to this related party, and they allege malafide and motives. So in such cases, there is always, and this happens not just in software, but in product design, in areas where you trust that person with whom you are wanting to take the design or the assistance or consulting, and he has the expertise, but he does have a few competitors. But the amount of time you will take to explain your business to a new guy, you tend to take an easy route and going to your known related party service provider. And that's the biggest part, as to justify whether you need that service provider, whether you can go to somebody else, and whether the value that you are giving is right, whether the contract that you have negotiated with them is usual. These are some of the difficult questions that managements at times are unable to respond favorably. But you can see when they try to explain what effort they have taken to find, if they have actually not taken any effort, that's an indicator that there is something could be wrong. But in another area that you can say is these transactions with parties where It's commodity whose prices change on a regular basis. And a small 5% variation can make a huge difference over a year, but it's very difficult for a management to explain that the formula that they prescribed was the right one. And you don't have the benefit of hindsight. You have the problem of looking forward and saying whether this will work. And these are the two areas. And the third and the most usual tough time for managements to respond is when their son is becoming the managing director. The compensation for a relative is always a problem. So you can never do it right. So you normally use the yardsticks of what you are paying your other managerial staff, but the effort that son of the managing director is deploying in that role may be 100 times more than any of the employees that you may have. But there is no way to judge that.
And that's a fantastic, very topical example you picked up in the end, Rajiv, quite unexpectedly. So does anyone else have any views to offer on this point? No? Great. So I'll move on. Thank you, Rajiv, for your candid responses. MPV, I'll come to you. Like accounting standards, right? Accounting standard 18, Ind AS 24, several disclosures.
I must just add that appointment of managing director and the remuneration is regulated other ways also. And at times it may not be strictly considered to be RPT. But that's the most difficult thing that independent directors have when they say whether that thing is right or not. Sorry for adding this piece.
No, thank you for adding, and completely makes sense. It is complicated, and that's the whole point of this conversation, to bring up these points and, to grapple with them. And through grappling, we'll probably move on the right track, which leads me back to MPV. So MPV, in terms of accounting standards, several disclosures, requirements, etc. there. In your eyes, what do you suggest, or you've come across or thought about that large companies could offer more in the annual reports by these disclosures?
No, my view, there is enough disclosure. I would only encourage the stakeholders to use the disclosures which are already made. I think that's important. I don't see any reason for increasing the same, and information overload will only reduce the relevance. In fact, one particular practice which I would like to share from my little experience of being an independent director on few boards is the parent entities should nominate their independent directors as director on their group entities and require them to report back a summary of the proceedings of those entities. Because many occasions there are transactions which happen between parent and subsidiary, loans given, long-term, short-term, etc. But the end use, etc., from there, the track is lost. I think that was what Mr. Anil Sharma was also trying to point out. And most of the frauds we come across are also that. So I think at the approval stage, there's a lot of good intent the parent board of directors do. But when it goes to the subsidiary from there, how it moves forward, you lose the control. So if you have this mechanism, it would help. And I would also encourage larger companies to have their committee meetings and board meetings spread across 2 days with a first day evening, a reasonable amount of socializing. There could be lots of information which will get gathered, shared, observations made, which will give the directors and a pulse of what's happening within the organization. In fact, most directors, very senior people like Mr. Santana Krishnan, he is almost 4 decades of experiences, have so much of experience in audit. And when they interact, they can pick up the pulse after a little bit of conversations and observation. So I see companies trying to crash in everything on a single day or half a day. I think if you could spread it over 2 days, probably the quality of deliberations will also increase, particularly audit committee and the board at least. I would expect longer hours to be spent.
Thank you, MPV. I think a very practical and pragmatic input there to take your time, do smell test, get the pulse, because that is where it is, the intangible of the transactions. Great. And of behavior, indication of behavior as well, right, which govern the transactions. SK, I'll come to you next. In your experience on boards, several boards, how influential or effective you have seen institutional investors and other shareholder groups, in your opinion, in monitoring and helping enforce good governance in RPTs?
First, I must compliment Vijay Kumar MPV for not allowing more disclosures. I think we've had too much of disclosures. I don't think people have any time to read. And in fact, analysts know the company better than the balance sheet or the disclosures that you have made. I always look for an analyst report before I go to the board meeting or the Money Control or some magazines, right? You get much more information than what the management itself will give. So I must compliment you for not wanting more disclosures. I think from my standpoint, while all the directors are very keen and a little scared about related parties, I don't think the nominees of institutional nominees are really aware. We always call them, in the early days, we used to call them as nodders. They will either say yes or no, but they will not say anything more. Now, of course, the character has changed, but they know that there is a related party transaction. I don't think they play any role in terms of deciding or to go ahead or not to go ahead. I think educating them on the need for related party transaction is absolutely essential. Probably the same with the shareholder group. Now I think they feel it's a reserved matter for the audit committee to decide and independent directors to decide. So I feel that they have to contribute much more. It should be a board responsibility, not independent directors' responsibility, as I mentioned earlier. Thank you.
Thank you, SK. And I'll just kind of tail end another question which I had for you in terms of, is levy of penalty by SEBI an adequate deterrent?
In our country, where there are three forms of government: bureaucracy in control, dominant shareholder being in control, and professionally managed companies. So you can't prescribe the same governance standards to all the three. One size fits all won't work, because chief secretary will be the chairman, joint secretary will be one of the directors. He will never be able to stand up and say, sir, it's not correct for us to say, it's not a related party, we should do it. Therefore, we have to set different standards. Second, in a country like ours, where the dominant shareholder is in control, punitive measures are essential. I think SEBI is doing a great job in terms of, at least people are not scared of the auditors or the independent directors. They're certainly scared of the SEBI. So in the initial years, when you bring in a control like this, I think regulatory controls are essential. Then once you graduate, people get into the part of their culture, then liberating them would be better. But I fully support SEBI's role and what they are doing up to now.
Thank you, SK. Leading to the $1 million question for Bhanu. Bhanu, what would you recommend and what would be your advice in companies that are still to form a comprehensive related party governance policy? What would you recommend as initial steps they take in order to meet the 4 pillars of good governance: accountability, responsibility, transparency, and fairness?
That's a very heavy loaded question. So let me try to see how I can decipher that. I will probably just, rely on some of the information which got discussed in the last 1 hour, because there are a lot of good points which came out, which is essential to develop a policy. I think related party transaction governance is a key element which depicts the corporate governance culture of the organization, right? And all high governed companies are focusing on ensuring right culture. So I think that's most important. And I think Mr. Sandana Krishnan also referred about integrity, right? So as you develop a policy, do you have enough riders or do you have enough factors to bring in good culture in the organization to disclose, or if there is a doubt, as Jagan mentioned, in case of doubt, disclose it. So I think that's one critical element. Though, does my policy address that aspect that, hey, look, if somebody comes up with a transaction, we will deal with it, we will review it, and then we'll go up. Second, I've already spoken about the process and technology. I'll not go more in detail. I think one element which is important is how do we bring in the culture of early consultation with all stakeholders? It should not happen that all the transaction is done and then we are going for approval. It is, does the company have enough mechanism, and do I write in my policy that I build in a mechanism where I consult the board, audit committee, auditors, governance experts, consultants before a transaction is finalized? Then, having done all the transaction, then we go for an approval. While it is pre-approval, but I've already structured the entire transaction. And I think one of the other aspect MP mentioned, which is all about emerging practices, is how do I review my subsidiary transaction? Does my policy address that? How do I review the recoverability of balances from the related parties of the subsidiaries? The money which is given, basically post approval review mechanism. Have I factored that into the policy? The most important, and is also most often we as auditors are asked about, hey, have you identified all RPTs and are they at arm's length? We have addressed about the first one about identifying RPTs. Are they at arm's length? A great level of documentation and deliberation is critical, and how do I factor that into the policy? I hope I've done justice to this question. I'll request every other panelist to chip into this. It is $1 million question.
No, thank you, Bhanu. I think that's very useful. And we'll take the last few minutes, 2-3 minutes only, in fact, on the session today. And there are some very, very interesting questions, and I'd like to pose a few of them to you. And I'll start with an easy one for Rajiv. Rajiv, there are different regulations and definitions under SEBI for related party versus Companies Act. So how does one go about when a related party is getting covered in, say, SEBI definition, the LODR definition, but not under Companies Act? So what would you recommend in that situation?
No, you have to comply, because if you're a listed company, the tougher regulation has to be followed. And not only the tougher regulation, now there's this accounting standard. If you are following Ind AS 24 or even under the earlier accounting standard 18, there were certain definitions which were not exactly what the company law or the listing regulations provided. So you have to be mindful of all those regulations, and the toughest of those have to be complied. So if you comply with the SEBI LODR regulations, you most of all you will comply with the company law regulations, except there are some few minor differences. But the essence of the transaction is it at arm's length? Is it ordinary course of business? Is it being done in the interest of all the stakeholders or just a group of shareholders? If you ask that question, invariably you get the answer. So if it is in the interest of the company and the shareholders and the stakeholders, more often than not, you will find the right answer. As I said, it's more of a judgment call that you take. There can never be an objective test. Whatever processes you may put in, they will help you. It's a tool. You may take the right decision, but the decision at the end of the day is based on the facts around the table, and you need to look at it very dispassionately.
Absolutely, Rajiv. Thanks for that. And yes, I completely agree with you. If it's covered under and you're a listed company, you need to comply. Straightforward. Now, there's this practical situation which managements face where, you're computing a arm's length price for related party transactions. You're satisfying auditors for Companies Act, financial statements point of view, accounting standards point of view, then various other requirements. And then there's the income tax department that comes and rejects your transaction. So the question that is asked is, how do they handle this situation?
No, so it's very easy. See, the perspective of the tax authorities and the computation mechanism is very different from SEBI compliance requirements or the corporate law compliance requirements. Just because your transfer pricing was not determined, which was accepted by the tax authorities, does not mean that you failed all the other tests. But the corollary may be true. If you actually did everything right, good chance that your transfer pricing from tax perspective was also right. But the problem is the tax authorities look at only revenue from their perspective. And that may not always be the right number, because the management and the company's board takes a decision based on what is in the best interest of the company. It may not be always in the best interest of the tax authorities.
Absolutely. And that is why we have courts and we have loads of litigation piled up out there. So Rajiv, thanks for that. I think we are at time, in fact, a minute over time. But there is one question I'd like us to kind of share, just we can go around on the culture, how to drive the right culture from the top. And if you could just share a quick insight on that, each one, and we can start with Rajiv, that how does one go about instituting great culture in the corporate so that, you know, the good governance is a natural result of that? Rajiv, I come to you first.
So I think this question was answered by Vijay right at the beginning. It has to begin at the top and you have to walk the talk. So if you take all decisions, looking at and taking views from all the colleagues that are relevant, and they all agree with the decision making and the selection that you did, and you are transparent, you show that there is no special interest being created for any particular person or group of persons. People just below you realize that and learn that and follow that. As Vijay rightly said, that what he learned 20 years back in his first employment carries on with him even till date. And this happens with all of us. We have all learned in our early days, and that foundation continues with us. So I think that's the answer.
Absolutely. And I think we just need to keep walking the talk. I see all the panelists nodding, so I'm not again going to labor the point. And I'd like to share something which we do in our firm. And we have 18 culture concepts. And we keep on living it, training people on it, and just have conversations around it and live the culture so that it becomes part of our DNA. With that, I'd like to close this fantastic, fabulous panel discussion. Thank you very much. It's been a privilege. Have a great day ahead.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks on behalf of CII to all the panelists and Fatima for moderating the session so well. And thanks to all the participants for joining and making this webinar a success on behalf of CII. Thanks to all the colleagues at CII team led by Merin and other colleagues. Thank you all as well.